Welcome back to PSC Tech Byte. Today we keep on talking about how you can easily extend Microsoft Teams using a SharePoint framework. And specifically, I want to explain you how you can create a SharePoint framework Teams tab, which can be used to consume an external REST API. In fact, in SharePoint framework, you can easily consume any REST API as long as it is registered in Azure Active Directory. And from a Teams tab point of view, you can easily do that. You can create, for example, an Azure function, register it in Azure Active Directory, and consume it from SharePoint Framework and from a Teams tab. And this is the real true power, in my opinion, of being able to extend Teams with the SharePoint Framework, because you can easily consume a line of business system using a SharePoint Framework client-side web part. So let me move to the demo environment. Let me show you how to create such kind of solution. So first of all, let's have a look at the final result of the solution I'm going to explain you how to create. And I am in Teams and I have a custom Teams tab that I built with SharePoint Framework. And this tab renders a list of customers coming out from a fake CRM system just for the sake of making an example of something that I can use in a line of business integration solution. This custom theme tab is a SharePoint Framework web part, and as such, I can use exactly the same web part also in a modern page or in a classic page of SharePoint Online. Now, this web part is consuming a backend API which has been built using an Azure function. So let me briefly switch to my Azure portal, and here is the function I'm consuming. First of all, this is a function which provides a function called the LOB Function, which I created using Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio Code with all of the extensions for Azure. And this is the basic implementation of my function. It is really trivial. I just get the configuration settings in order to get the connection string. I create an entity framework context, and then I get a collection of customers from my backend SQL Azure database, and I return back those customers as a JSON object to the consumer of my API. From an Azure function configuration point of view, under the authentication and authorization, my Azure function is configured to log in with Azure Active Directory, and from an Azure Active Directory perspective, it is configured to use a specific client ID, as you can see, which is the client ID of an application that I registered in Azure Active Directory, together with the issue URL, which will uniquely identify the tenant in which I want to use my API, to make my API available. Moreover, I have the allowed token audiences, which means what are the audiences which are allowed in the open authorization access tokens that my Azure function will receive and will validate. And if the Azure function will get an access token for any of the listed allowed token audiences, that token will be considered a valid one. And this is the token audience that I configure, which is exactly the one I have if I go back to my target tenant in Azure Active Directory for my application. In fact, this is the application that I registered in Azure Active Directory. As you can see, this is the client ID that I was using also for the Azure function authentication and authorization settings. And here, my application registered in Azure Active Directory is configured to expose an API with a specific application URI, which is the one we used as the target audience in the Azure function settings, together with a custom permission scope called customers.read for that specific application audience. So this is the AAD Azure Active Directory application registered in my target tenant, which maps to the Azure function that I have on the other side. Moreover, from a SharePoint Framework point of view, here is the React component that I have in my solution, which renders the list of customers. Well, my web part, which is also configured to be a Teams tab, will simply provide the SharePoint Framework context to the target React component, which does the actual rendering of my UI and of my content. And in the manifest of my web part, I configure, as usual, the web part to be also a Teams tab and not only a SharePoint web part. Well, in the state of my web part, in the state of my React component under the cover of the web part, I have a loading Boolean value just to show if the content is loading, and I have a property called customers, which is an array of iCustomer types, where iCustomer is a single customer made of an ID, of a display name, of an email, and of a rating. In the React component, whenever I want to load the customers, I get from the context of SharePoint Framework through the AD HTTP client factory object a client for that specific audience, which is the one of my target Azure function and of my target Azure AD registered application. Once I've got back the client for making the AD HTTP client calls, I simply define the request headers to specify that I want to get back an application JSON response, and using the client I make a GET request for the URL of my Azure function, providing the options that will properly configure my HTTP REST request. I will get back an HTTP client response, which will be a JSON object, so I get it as a JSON object, which will actually be the array of customers that I want to get. And in fact, if I go back to my Azure infrastructure, here we can see that this is the output that I get back from my Azure function. The ID of every customer, the display name, the email, and the rating for every single customer. I get those information, I put them in the state of my React component, and I simply render with a detailed list the content of my list of customers. But in order to making it possible to use that API from my SharePoint Framework web part, I also need to declare in the package solution.json file that my application will require some web API permissions through the web API permission request configuration settings, and I specify that I need the permissions with a scope called customer.read for the API with name Paolo Pia line of business sample, which is exactly the name of my application in Azure Active Directory, and it is exactly the name of the permission scope for my application. So I create such a SharePoint Framework solution, I configure the web API permission request, I use the AD HTTP client factory to get a client and to make the request. I also decided to configure my application for domain isolated scope so that my application will have specific permissions dedicated to the application. And once I've done that, I can easily go to the app catalog of my tenant. I can get the SPPKG file of my application and drag and drop it onto the app catalog. I already have it, of course, so I will replace it. And then I will be able to confirm that I want to make my solution tenant-wide available, and I will also be able to go to the SharePoint Admin Center, and under the Advanced API Access section, in the pending request, I will find a pending request, which I already approved in my scenario, for my isolated solution. Here it is, Paolo Pia line of business sample is the target resource that I want to consume with a specific scope, which is customer read. And I will have to select and approve that permission request. If I already granted that permission to my solution, so I don't need to do it again. By doing that, inside my Teams tab built with SharePoint Framework, I will be able to make a request secured with open authorization and with Azure Active Directory in order to reach the target Azure function and being able to call my target API. One more thing that I need to keep into account is that my solution will be running under the context of SharePoint Online and Microsoft Teams. As such, the Azure function from a course point of view will have to grant the permission to the SharePoint Online URL to invoke that API. And that's why if I go back to my Azure function settings right here, and if I go to the course settings for my function, I can see that in the list of allowed origins, I also have the tenant for which I'm executing the solution, I'm running the solution, which is PSysDev in my scenario. And this is the name of the URI, which will be the origin for the consumer of this Azure function. Why this name? Because my client-side solution, my SharePoint Framework solution, is configured to be domain isolated, and as such, it will be executed under this specific domain. In case you will not create a domain isolated solution, you will simply need to provide as the allowed origin the name of your tenant.sharepoint.com. But in my scenario, being the fact that I have a domain isolated solution, I have to provide this specific URL, which you can easily retrieve if you want by using the F12 functionality in the browser, and you can see what is the URL of the iframe rendered in your page right here. So it's quite a long journey, but with few steps you can make it possible to have a line of business system fully integrated with SharePoint Framework and with Microsoft Teams using a Teams tab built with SharePoint Framework. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.